In 1914, British explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton set out on what was intended to be one of the greatest expeditions of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. His goal was ambitious: to complete the first land crossing of the Antarctic continent, traveling from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea through the South Pole. To accomplish this, Shackleton assembled a crew of 27 men and purchased a Norwegian-built wooden ship named Endurance. Designed for polar conditions, the vessel measured just over 44 meters, or 144 feet in length, and featured a heavily reinforced hull built to withstand pressure from sea ice. On August 8, 1914, just 4 days after Britain entered the First World War, Endurance departed Plymouth, England. Shackleton had offered both his ship and his crew to the British government for the war effort, but the Admiralty instructed him to continue with the expedition as planned. After crossing the Atlantic, the expedition reached South Georgia, a remote island in the South Atlantic that served as the last inhabited stop before Antarctica. There, experienced Norwegian whalers delivered a warning. The sea ice in the Weddell Sea was unusually heavy that season. Several captains advised Shackleton to delay his departure until conditions improved. He listened, but only for a short time. On December 5, 1914, Endurance left South Georgia and headed south toward Antarctica. Within weeks, the expedition would encounter conditions unlike anything its crew had expected. After leaving South Georgia, Endurance entered the Weddell Sea, one of the most ice-filled regions surrounding Antarctica. For several weeks, the expedition made steady progress, navigating through leads of open water between large fields of drifting pack ice. Whenever the route became blocked, the crew waited for shifting winds or currents to create a new passage before continuing south. As the days passed, the openings in the ice became smaller and less frequent. On January 18, 1915, approximately 76 miles or 121 kilometers from Vassal Bay, Endurance became firmly trapped in the pack ice. Despite repeated attempts to free the ship using its engines, sails, and manual labor, the surrounding ice would not release its grip. At first, Shackleton believed the situation was temporary. The crew settled into a routine while they waited for the ice to break apart and allow the ship to continue south. But the expected thaw never came. Instead, the drifting pack ice slowly carried Endurance farther away from its intended destination. As the Antarctic winter approached, temperatures continued to fall and daylight grew shorter until the sun disappeared below the horizon for weeks at a time. With no possibility of sailing, the crew focused on maintaining the ship and adapting to life on the frozen sea. Scientific observations continued whenever conditions allowed. The men cared for the expedition's sled dogs, hunted seals and penguins to supplement their food supplies, and organized regular routines to keep both the ship and themselves in good condition during the long winter. Although Endurance had been built to withstand heavy ice, no wooden ship could remain completely safe under constant pressure. As the months passed, the drifting ice surrounding the vessel became increasingly unstable. Large floes collided with one another, creating enormous forces that slowly began pressing against the ship's reinforced hull. The expedition had entered Antarctica, expecting to cross a continent. Instead, they found themselves prisoners of the drifting ice, with no clear indication of when or if they would ever sail again. By the end of the Antarctic winter, Endurance remained firmly imprisoned in the drifting pack ice. Instead of breaking free, the ship was carried farther north as the entire ice field slowly drifted with the currents of the Weddell Sea. As spring returned in September 1915, the movement of the surrounding ice became more violent. Large floes collided with increasing force, squeezing the ship from every direction. The reinforced timbers that had protected Endurance for months could no longer withstand the immense pressure. The hull began to twist, wooden beams buckled. The sound of cracking timber echoed through the ship as the ice continued to tighten its grip. The crew worked continuously to unload supplies onto the surrounding ice before the vessel was completely destroyed. Food, fuel, sledging equipment, 3 lifeboats, scientific records, navigation instruments, and other essential supplies were carefully removed from the ship whenever conditions allowed. On October 27, 1915, after concluding that Endurance could no longer be saved, Shackleton ordered the crew to abandon the vessel. The men established a camp on the nearby sea ice and watched as their ship remained trapped nearby, slowly collapsing under the pressure. For weeks, Endurance continued to break apart. Then, on November 21, 1915, the ship finally slipped beneath the surface of the Weddell Sea. It disappeared into water more than 3,000 meters or nearly 10,000 feet deep. The expedition had lost its only ship. Its original objective was no longer possible. Now stranded on drifting sea ice hundreds of miles from the nearest inhabited settlement, the crew faced an entirely different challenge: reaching home. With endurance gone, the expedition's survival depended entirely on the supplies they had managed to save before the ship sank. The men lived in tents pitched directly on the drifting sea ice, sharing the frozen landscape with seals and penguins while carefully rationing their food and fuel. Whenever possible, hunting parties provided fresh meat, reducing the expedition's dependence on its limited stored provisions. Shackleton initially hoped the crew could march across the ice toward Paulet Island, where emergency supplies had been left by an earlier expedition. The attempt quickly proved impossible. The pressure ridges formed by colliding ice floes created an almost impassable landscape, and every sled had to be hauled by hand across uneven, constantly shifting terrain. After several exhausting days, the expedition had covered only a small fraction of the required distance. Shackleton abandoned the plan and ordered the men to establish another camp on the drifting ice. Instead, they waited. For months, the entire ice field continued to drift slowly northward, carrying the expedition with it. The men maintained strict daily routines, repaired equipment, cared for the lifeboats, hunted whenever opportunities arose, and waited for the sea ice to weaken. As food supplies became increasingly limited, difficult decisions had to be made. The expedition's sled dogs, which had been brought to Antarctica for the planned crossing of the continent, could no longer be supported with the available food. On Shackleton's orders, the dogs were euthanized. By April 1916, the drifting ice that had carried the expedition for more than a year began to break apart under the movement of the sea. Remaining on the ice was no longer possible. The crew loaded their supplies into the 3 lifeboats, James Caird, Dudley Docker, and Stancomb Wills, and launched into the frigid waters of the Southern Ocean. After several days battling freezing temperatures, rough seas, and drifting ice, the exhausted men reached Elephant Island on April 15, 1916. For the first time in months, the men stood on solid ground, but Elephant Island offered little hope. It was remote, uninhabited, and far outside the normal shipping routes. For the first time since endurance had become trapped, the expedition was no longer drifting. They were stranded. Elephant Island offered temporary safety, but it also presented a new problem. No permanent settlements existed on the island, and ships rarely passed through the surrounding waters. If the expedition remained there, rescue was unlikely. Shackleton concluded that the only realistic chance of saving his men was to seek help himself. He selected 5 companions for the journey: Frank Worsley, the expedition's captain and navigator; Tom Crean, one of Britain's most experienced polar explorers; Timothy McCarthy, a skilled seaman; John Vincent; and Harry McNish, the ship's carpenter. Their destination was the whaling stations on South Georgia. The distance was approximately 800 nautical miles, or about 1,500 kilometers, across one of the roughest stretches of ocean in the world. The 6 men departed Elephant Island on April 24, 1916, aboard the James Caird, a lifeboat just over 22 feet, or 6.9 meters. Before leaving, the boat had been strengthened using timber salvaged from Endurance, fitted with a makeshift deck, and loaded with enough food and supplies for the voyage. For more than 2 weeks, the crew faced freezing temperatures, towering waves, strong winds, and constant exposure to seawater. Navigation depended largely on Frank Worsley, who used a sextant whenever brief breaks in the clouds allowed him to observe the sun. Despite the difficult conditions, the James Caird reached the southern coast of South Georgia on May 10, 1916. The voyage, however, was not yet over. Violent seas prevented a landing along much of the coastline, forcing the crew to continue searching for a suitable place to come ashore. When they finally landed, they discovered they were on the uninhabited southern side of the island. The whaling stations lay on the opposite coast, separated by rugged mountains, glaciers, and terrain that had never been crossed inland. Unable to sail around the island in their damaged boat, Shackleton decided to cross the mountains on foot. On May 19th, Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean left the remaining 3 men behind and began the crossing carrying only the essential equipment they could manage. After approximately 36 hours of continuous travel over glaciers, snowfields, and steep mountain ridges, they reached the whaling station at Stromness on May 20th, 1916. For the first time in more than a year and a half, members of the expedition had reached civilization. But 22 men were still waiting on Elephant Island. After reaching Stromness, Shackleton immediately began organizing a rescue for the men left behind on Elephant Island. His first 3 attempts failed. Each time, heavy sea ice prevented the rescue ships from reaching the island. More than 4 months had passed since the James Caird had departed, and the men who remained behind had survived by sheltering beneath 2 upturned lifeboats, reinforced with stones and canvas. They continued hunting seals for food, while carefully rationing the supplies Shackleton had left with them. Despite the isolation and uncertainty, the group maintained discipline under the leadership of Frank Wild, whom Shackleton had placed in command before departing. Finally, on August 30, 1916, the Chilean naval tug Yelcho, commanded by Captain Luis Pardo, reached Elephant Island. As the ship approached the shoreline, Shackleton searched the beach through binoculars. He counted the figures standing on the rocks. All 22 men were there. Not a single one had been lost. The rescue was completed that same day, bringing the Endurance expedition to an end after nearly 2 years. The Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition had failed in its original objective. No one had crossed Antarctica. Yet the expedition became one of history's greatest survival stories. 28 men had entered the Antarctic aboard Endurance. 28 men returned home. More than a century later, Ernest Shackleton's leadership during the expedition continues to be studied by historians, military organizations, and leadership programs around the world. In 2022, the wreck of Endurance was discovered nearly 3,000 meters beneath the Weddell Sea, remarkably well preserved by the freezing Antarctic waters. It rested almost exactly where it had been crushed and sunk 107 years earlier. The ship that gave the expedition its name never completed its journey. Its crew did. This was a real tale from history.